Dom, Dom, Dom.
Hey, Jenna. How's
Hey,
it going?
well, it's oh my God, what another? I feel like every week is like what a week, but I will say this is one of those. I'm getting enough distance from our former gig to not feel the itch to want to cover every breaking news situation, and I think I'm finally there now because news has been breaking just left and right, and I'm like, too bad for you in the
Same,
newsroom.
same. It's like, you know what? I don't know the latest, and I'm kind of cool with that.
Yeah, like I mean, obviously, I'm following along,
Yeah,
but every detail, I don't
no.
know. Kind of nice. I'm starting to understand, like, oh my God, is this a slippery slope to the people who are like, I don't follow politics? Like, are we on that slippery slope right now?
Oh
Because I
no.
will say that ignorance is kind of blissful.
Sometimes it is.
All right, well, on that note, let's start the show. Hi, I'm Jenna,
And I'm Dom, and we're both award-winning journalists.
who've recently been laid off.
Our industry is experiencing a seismic shift, and it's shed a lot of really good journalists.
So, where does that leave us? Well, we're definitely laid off.
And we're looking for new jobs, looking for what's left of the industry, and what to do next.
And we're looking at all of it. So if you're a fellow laid off journalist, a working journalist, or someone who admires the craft, we're looking to build community.
Develop new skills, and try to figure out what just happened.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking. So what's going on?
Well, let's start off with the headlines. There's been stuff going on here. So the first headline we're going to talk about, Jenna, is about the latest Paramount Global layoffs. So this
Oh,
is phase two that happened this week, phase two of their plan, where they're laying off a total of around 2,000 positions, which is 15% of their U.S. workforce. Okay.
wow.
And just to focus a little bit on the news, because Paramount owns CBS, the
They have a
network.
lot of media properties, yeah.
There, and one of them is CBS the network. And so basically, in terms of news media, they laid off a couple of journalists, a few journalists. Jeff Glor. Now, Jeff Glor was he once anchored CBS Evening News, and he's been with CBS News since 2007. But of course, he left, and then Nora O'Donnell took over.
Mm-hmm.
He's been still working with them, but he was laid off. And also, there were a couple of other journalists who they mentioned that were high profile. And this is Deadline who reported this. There was Anna Werner, who was a senior consumer investigative correspondent, and Ben Tracy, who was the senior national and environmental correspondent. So, still, like,
It's a
of
lot of
course, layoffs.
seniors.
Yeah, yeah. And there might be others who were there who just weren't reported on, but still, just shows that in terms of news still being hurt and media being, certainly layoffs still happening within the industry, and it just continues.
Yeah, no, it does continue. And the only reason why I bring up there it's a lot of seniors is simply because that's also a lot of experience. I mean, I know that those are probably also bigger paychecks.
Hmm.
And sometimes when you're balancing a budget, getting rid of the big paychecks is a direct way to do that. But that's, like also time and experience. And this is definitely one of those fields where the longer you do this, the better you get at it. And but then there's that, that balance of like, yes, you've been doing this for a long time, and so you're really, really good at it. But at the same time, we need to give the next generation a chance to get really, really good at it. So some people you almost have to forcibly, I guess, get them to
Yeah,
step aside. I don't know.
I guess I think like in this situation, I agreed, like in terms of, I think it only has to do with paychecks and getting rid of people who just, you know, they look at their bottom line, look at paychecks. And also, I guess maybe also in terms of, can other reporters and other journalists cover these stories? Having other people take on certain other responsibilities, which is what happens with all these jobs. It's like, instead of just, hey, I was covering science. Well, now you're covering science, and you're covering also the environment. So
Yeah,
that sort of, I feel, is sort of what's happening, where they just start taking on multiple jobs, which means then all of a sudden certain fields don't get
they don't get
reported on
the
as much.
individual attention, yeah, that they used to.
So,
All right. Well, what else is going on in the world?
Well, we were going to talk about the Sean Diddy Combs case, correct?
Yes.
So do you want to sort of lay the
All right.
groundwork a little bit?
Well, I guess so. The big thing with that is, um, this is a perfect, the Diddy case to me is a perfect example of the different ways that people accuse the media of being unwilling to or not wanting to report different storylines. And that's not always the case because not every conspiracy theory or rumor is an actual verifiable story. And again, any reputable media source is only going to report like information that is verifiable. And a hot rumor mill does not equal a verified source. So very, very, I guess, helpfully and thoughtfully, the good people over at Vox, specifically, who do we have to thank for this piece? Um,
Oh,
L
mm,
Lavanya Ramanathan, I think, and Anna North put together a whole thing basically about 7 questions and
mm.
0 conspiracy theories about the allegations against Sean Diddy Combs. Everything we know about the case against the music mogul. And it's really, I thought it was really, really important because it does focus on the facts of the case and what exactly is known. Um, and then other questions that a lot of people have, like, what's on these well, not alleged tapes because they were in the indictment. So, what's on these tapes and will they ever be released to the public? Why is everyone talking about the baby oil part of the indictment? Are there other celebrities connected to the case? And I thought that was also really important because there's become this, I guess, need to try to figure out who else might be implicated in all of this. And through that, a lot of people, especially online, are looking at old pictures from Diddy parties or any kind of Diddy picture. This could be like at a award show or a fashion show or just on the street. And if you took a picture with him, suddenly you're implicated, which opens the door for other nefarious actors.
Well, and also what a lot of people are doing online are creating these AI images where they're putting certain well-known figures with Diddy, so therefore creating questions about who knew what. There's also the whole thing of, I guess, yeah, this is I know what I notice a lot also are people creating these timelines of other well-known CEOs, big people within the industries, different parts of the industry who were either resigned were or quit their jobs around the same time as Diddy was arrested, and looking at whether or not they're somehow, does that mean they're tied to this? And so much of it just ends up getting, believed to be so because it's like a lot of people out there just aren't, you know, I guess as they start treating one as they try start treating themselves as journalists and just putting out theories that they think are possible. And what ends up happening is a lot of misinformation as to what is really happening here. And I think that's the thing too. We do know some things, but the biggest thing we know is he's charged with racketeering, conspiracy, sex trafficking, transportation to engage in prostitution. He's possible of he's pled guilty. I mean, oh no, so he's pled not guilty. Um, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
all these charges, like those are some of the facts. And I guess I'm really even just waiting to see what happens as
Well,
the
I
case
think that's
closer.
part of like because obviously, especially social media, it wants, updated information or immediate information or etc. But to be able to, to find out the answers to some of these questions is going to take time. We're not going to know for certain for a while. And again, a hunch is not a verifiable fact. Listen, I've seen some of the memes and the, posts and the videos, and I understand why people are thinking that, there's probably something to this in the way. But the bottom line is we don't officially know. And until you officially know, no, it can't be reported on.
It's
Or it
really
shouldn't be, I should say.
Uh, but also it shows, like you just said about social media, so often, like I remember with the Idaho murders, remember the four college students who were murdered. There was so much, I guess, people were so hungry for new information. And when they couldn't get it because there was an open investigation, people became really angry at the police and I want to know. And that's just not how the system works. So I think that this really makes for, you know, a real it makes for a place where people can just start wanting to create their own facts. They get into conspiracy theories and what they think could have been, you know, uh, could have been possible.
Hmm.
And that's where, and then it becomes up to journalists to somehow really be aware of that and kind of I think there is a responsibility of journalists to kind of call out this misinformation and look
Of
at the
course, and
facts.
parse out those facts. And this is not to say, I do want to be clear that this is not to say that some of the things that people are talking about were like, this really,
Correct.
it doesn't mean that that's incorrect. It means that
Correct.
none of it is verifiable yet. And you need, like, again, a hunch is not a fact, or like a strong feeling or an inclination is not a fact.
I know there was a lot of also people falling. There were some celebrities who were, I guess, took down their Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it. And there was a lot of, I guess, people.
Wiping Instagram pages clean and
And then it came back and people started questioning, well, what happened there? Why did you do that? Are you trying to hide information? This is again where I think like people want answers right away, and that's just not how it never worked that way. And
nope.
because a lot of just like in the Idaho case, there were real, and aside from the victims who were a part of that crime, there were victims who are being accused of being part of that crime who had absolutely nothing to do with it. Again, the importance of us all just looking at this and being patient. I know that we all want answers right away, but it really is about being patient. And I'm glad the media is trying to write some of these theories and just say, here's what we know. And honestly, that's the best we could do right now.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. But actually, I think that understanding or actually, not maybe not understanding, but going back and revisiting one of these big stories is that's why that's so important. And I think that's part of what makes true crime, perhaps for a lot
Yeah.
of people, in the podcast industry so fascinating is it's a chance once all the dust has settled to go back and revisit this story and really unpack what we understood in real time, what we got right, what we got wrong, and how, again, misinformation, rumor, innuendo in some cases took over.
What a great segue to our next interview, Jenna.
I'm professional. All right, well, let's go to it then, because this was a fun one, and it actually does deal with that very subject. This week, we're taking you back to November of 2014. Yeah, back in the Wayback Machine. It's a time when one of the most notorious cyber attacks in Hollywood history, the Sony Pictures hack, took place. Now, the scandal involved North Korea, leaked emails, and a controversial comedy called The Interview. In case anybody forgot, that was starring Seth Rogen and James Franco. As we look back at the story, we'll also discuss how journalists then covered the hack and if it would be covered the same way today. Now, joining us on the show is Brian Raftery. Brian is a journalist, author, and the host of a new three-part narrative series from Spotify and the Ringer podcast network called The Hollywood Hack. You can find episodes in the Big Picture podcast feed. Brian, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. All right. So I guess to start with, the beginning is why even revisit this story? I mean, it's with all of the many, 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 many stories. But this is like, wait, count. Yeah, 10. There we go. I had to count 10 years
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah, I mean the 10 years is definitely one entry point because we're all from media and journalism backgrounds, and we all know that anniversaries are still, for some reason, there is some sort of Pavlovian response we have to anniversaries. We're like, oh, it's time to look back at that thing 5 years later, 25 years later. But mostly, I was interested in it for a couple of reasons. One is that in the last couple of years, there have been nothing on the scale of the Sony hack in terms of leaks, but there have been a sort of steady stream of stories out here in Hollywood where I live about, a big studio executive's text getting leaked or getting released and having some real collateral damage, or certain text messages or Slacks getting released. And every time that would happen, especially if it was in the TV or movie industry, I would just think, didn't everyone kind of remember the Sony hack? Like, didn't like, don't write anything down for God's sake. Like,
Have we
um,
learned nothing?
and we haven't, and I'm absolutely guilty of that as well. I mean, there were times during the Sony hack when I was writing an email about the podcast, and I was like, or during the podcast, where I was like, yeah, I'm going to make this a phone call. nothing at all, too inflammatory, but just the kind of thing where I'm like, just to be safe at this point. So I was interested in the kind of lingering effects of that and the impact it had, but I was also mostly interested in the fact that, this was a very rare event that combined the media, Hollywood, technology, the North Korean government. It's not very often that those kind of forces interact or kind of intersect. And it just felt kind of forgotten to me. I mean, I do think that the first half of the 2010s is going to be, when we look back, the kind of forgotten half decade, because everything that happened afterward was just so extreme and severe.
Wow, that's
But
true.
yeah, I mean, it's wild to me. I would look back at some of the stuff going on even in 2014, and I'd be like, I forgot about that. Or it's just sort of, it's one of those weird things where,
But those were the
I
Obama years. Anyway, no, but I'm now thinking in real time because we have the aughts. The aughts were, like very significant for a whole bunch of reasons. Um, and then my mind it skips to like the terrible 20s.
Yeah, I think in the 2000s, if you were to say name 5 key events from the 2000s, people would say obviously 9/11, Katrina, the economic meltdown. I think if you go for like the 2010s, they go, oh, COVID, the 2016 election, and then it sort of becomes like, what's the third, fourth? It's just those two
Yeah.
things overshadowed so many. And
Anywho,
this was a huge event, and the fact that it happened so quickly. I mean, it was basically bracketed between Thanksgiving weekend 2014 and Christmas 2014. The fact that it happened so, like, the news kept changing every day. Was North Korea involved? What is this movie actually the reason why they're being hacked? Oh my gosh, look at what leaked in this. Look what came out in this batch of emails. Look at the data coming out here in this leaked salary document. There was just so much going on that I think for most people, unless you were really invested in this professionally or personally, it was a story that you just looked at and said, I don't understand all the moving pieces here. I'm just going to keep touch with this and kind of forget about it, which is what I think a lot of people did. And for the people who worked at Sony, and there were thousands of them, this was a life-changing event. I mean, they had, you had people who were not high-powered executives who had to worry about, their kids' health insurance records being leaked, or their social security number being out there, or whether their studio was under threat of physical attack. That it was a very wild sequence of events. And so for me, every time I talk about it with someone, people would say, "Oh, I forgot about that." And that's, as a journalist, that's like, it's like the one thing you want to hear. You're like, "Oh, good, if you forgot about it, that means other people have too, and that means I have an excuse now to go and look at it again."
And Brian, you also were supposed to, back then, you were in December, you were supposed to interview Seth Rogen and James Franco for another, you were working on as a journalist, you were supposed to interview, and then they, of course, ended up canceling on you at that moment. My question is kind of like, did you being in there in that moment, being a journalist at the moment, did you have a sense of how big this story was going to get and how crazy it was going to get?
It's funny. I was working at Yahoo Movies, and it was actually a coworker was going to interview them, and I was just helping to kind of guide the
Okay.
coverage and figure out questions and stuff. So, and it was a very weird day where because this was all it'd become pretty clear by that day. I think it was a Monday or Tuesday, that this was not going well. I think there were a lot of questions of, should this movie even come out at this point? I mean,
Hmm.
I wasn't asking those questions, but other people were. And I do remember that morning being like, is this going to happen? And everyone at Sony saying, nope, nope, they're coming. They have a whole schedule of promotional events. And then as the hours went on, it was like, oh, they're in the car, they're on their way, they'll be half hour late. And then I was looking at the news, and the news, just more news kept coming out, and I was like, I don't think this is going to happen. I don't know why they're pretending. And eventually, yes, we got an email saying, the interview was canceled. But I definitely at that point, I was, because I was at Yahoo Movies, this was a huge story for us, but we mostly just syndicated the trades. We basically had like a deal with the Hollywood Reporters, so we would run all these big Hollywood Reporter stories. And I was very aware that the Hollywood business side at that point was a huge story, because at this point, certain comments that Amy Pascal and Scott Rudin had made had already come out. And in some ways, where I was, the business side of it almost overshadowed the geopolitical implications of the cyber attack kind of part of it. But I was certainly aware of both of it. And And it was it's one of those weird things where when you're covering news or part of news and there's a very strange event that happens in one day, you kind of all have this kind of shared kind of shock and let's jump on this and do it right now. When it's something that slowly kind of unfolds over a period of weeks, you just come in every day and you're like, this is still weird, right? This is weird, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's one of those things where you're not really realizing the bigger magnitude. You're just coming in on a day to day and being like, this story's still going. All right, this is day 18 of us covering this. But I don't think anyone really grappled kind of the magnitude of what this event was until maybe even months or years later.
So you also know, just looking back about how this whole podcast came together, doing a little bit of background, so you come up with this idea and then you pitch it, obviously, to the Ringer and Spot. You work there oftentimes, right? You work with them.
Yeah,
on
this is
other
the third show
podcasts.
I've done with them. Yeah, yeah.
So explain a little bit to our listeners who, how does that happen? You pitch your story, your idea, and then how does that process go along from like when you concept to then execution where it's being dropped? How long does that process take and what is it like?
The timeline of that process is always tough to figure out because I'm always doing a couple of things at once. So it's like sometimes you're like, so for example, we started talking about a third show while we were winding down the last show I did, which came out last summer about Vietnam movies. So, and then we take a couple of weeks off and then I would sort of send some ideas. This one, we were looking for a follow up. I originally had some ideas for shows that were like 7, 8, or 9 episodes, but we started talking about is there a show that we could just do in 3 episodes? Like, can we really just tell a really fast moving story? And I don't think this was a tough sell. I think I actually maybe even texted to someone who texted back and said, "Oh, this actually sounds good. Let's talk next week." And then once you sort of get like kind of a yellow light, or even before that, actually, I always write an outline. I mean, if you are it's not different than doing a book proposal in some ways. I try to write a very detailed outline for each episode, starting with I almost always say how the first episode is going to start. It doesn't have to be in great detail, but if I just say this is the scene we want to open with, because I always knew for the Sony hack it was going to be this moment where Obama, right before his vacation for 2014, has this massive press conference, and the first question is about the Sony hack, which is wild considering what else was going on in the world that year. So I knew that was going to be the opening, and I sort of laid out here it is in 3 episodes, and here are the ideas we want to hit. Here's some titles, and usually we kind of kick that document around back and forth, and then if we're all happy with it, if we all feel as if we can make it work, we kind of go ahead. But as with all projects I've worked on, I start out with a very firm idea of like, this is what episode 3 is going to be like. This is episode 2, and then you start doing interviews, and you think, oh, my outline does not make any sense at all. I got to move this from here. I didn't even know about this. We got this person to talk, which is wild. So they need their own segment here. So because the production, I think we actually started doing interviews maybe in January, February, and it was on air or on feeds by August. So that's a much quicker turnaround for any other show I've dealt with them. But it was also 3 episodes, which makes things a little bit easier.
Okay, so
go ahead.
I'm just wondering though that like with a story of this level of sensitivity and the time frame that you were working with, I mean those can be 2 incredibly big challenges for a story. I don't know. Was it really, really hard, like getting people to talk? Because sometimes when you have like an investigative story like this, and especially when you've got a deadline looming, you're feeling the pressure, but you can have like sources who are just like, oh my God, I've got a great story. Do you want to go on the record? No.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this for interviews for this was tough because I knew this show would 100% live or die on interviews. There's much great archival audio I could find from sit downs, from news broadcasts. I knew that if we did not get certain voices in there, and so the first, we did go to Amy Pascal and Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg and a lot of other very big players, and I think we heard pretty quickly they were not interested in talking, which was a bummer for me for like a day or two. But then I realized I sort of, as much as I would love to have them on the show, I don't know whether I needed them to tell the story I wanted to tell. Which to me, the bigger story to tell was how this impact the people working at Sony. Because if people who are listening can hear employees talk about what it's like to show up at work and find a crazy, corny-looking red skeleton, not red skeleton reform, but like a red skeleton hand on your screen saying you've been hacked. If people can tell me what that's like and what the fallout of that is like and what it's like on a day-to-day, I think listeners are going to be interested in that because that's the most relatable aspect of it. And so or very early on, Dan Sterling, who wrote the interview, agreed to speak with me, which was great. And he actually came to the studio. He's fantastic. But getting Sony employees to talk, I only reached out to former Sony employees because I knew anyone working there now most likely wasn't there 10 years ago. And either way, I don't think they want to talk about their current employer and probably have an NDA. But I went on LinkedIn. I mean, I apologize to any former Sony employees who got a message from me like a year ago saying with the headline Sony Hack podcast and the subject, which is probably not super comforting. But I was really trying to find as many people as I could to talk to me. And most of them talked on background. They did not want to talk on mic. I think some of them were worried they would say something that would get them in trouble, even though I don't think they would have. I mean, I think some of them were just worried about putting themselves out there after having already been hacked in their lives, and some of them were intentionally trying to keep their online presence minimal as a result. But at a certain point, I started finding some people who said, yeah, I would talk to you about this. And I think they wanted to talk about it because they realized what I realized, which is that some people had forgotten about this. And I think, I don't want to speak for the people I talked to at Sony, but I got the sense that they all felt like this was something that was either covered not accurately or not covered extensively enough, or that I think they wanted a chance to talk about their perspective of what it was like to go through this. And luckily, the people I found happened to be great interviews. I mean, they were just great on camera, great on microphone. It was kind of a dream scenario, considering I spent 3 or 4 weeks just panicking that I was going to get anyone to talk to me.
I know that panic.
Yeah.
You mentioned Dan Sterling, which I think who wrote the screenplay for the film. And I thought that was so interesting because you find out that initially when he wrote the screenplay, that he didn't have them killing the actual leader. It was when somebody suggested to them.
Yeah.
And he didn't say who suggested, which I thought was funny.
Yeah,
Well, because I mean, I think that's the thing everybody wants to know is like, wow. But at the same point, you realize without that edge, and he mentions it too, maybe it would have been a sort of sense of why even do this? Why even do the film? I think it's, it all leads to this whole thing of how, looking back, how people saw it all happening. And I think even talking about how real people were impacted by this.
Mm-hmm.
Did you hear from those people about really were there long-term effects? I mean, we saw people who were some people, of course, Amy Pascal stepped down, but what were some of the impacts did you hear from people about how this story, how it really played in their real lives?
I mean, some people I spoke to, and again, some of these people were on background and kind of give me a sense of what it was like. For some of them, this was deeply traumatizing. I mean, it was a situation in which the confusion of what was actually, it's in a way, the idea of not knowing whether to take a threat seriously is sometimes that kind of threat, a kind of vague threat, but a very loud, vague threat, can in some ways be a little more scary and unnerving than a direct threat, because you don't know whether to take it seriously. You don't know if you are a target or not. And I think there was a point in late December 2014 where, that the hackers had threatened the lives of Sony employees in a message. They had threatened the lives of their families. They had released data of some employees, family health records and stuff like that. And there was extra security on the Sony lot out in Culver City. And I just think, like, if you're just someone who works in, if you work in distribution and your job is to kind of, help make sure that a certain movie gets released in a certain region well and the theater owners are happy, you have to drive on a lot every day. And aside from all the stress of your job, you also have to wonder, am I under threat? And I think that was legitimately upsetting for a lot of people. And I think, I talked to a couple of people, not the ones in the show. I talked to at least 2 employees who told me that they left Sony afterward. Not immediately, but they were so frustrated and kind of shaken by it. And they were people who loved the company and just didn't feel comfortable there anymore, which I don't think is the majority of people who work there, but I think it's telling that there were some people who walked away feeling kind of unsafe, maybe unprotected by the company.
So as you're researching this story, you're going through the emails, you're finding all these details out. How did you decide which aspects of this story of the hacker that you wanted to get into on the show, in the podcast, and which one you didn't, what you didn't want to get into?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. Look, I think there's 170,000 emails, something like that.
Wow.
It's a lot. I did not read them all.
Oh my God.
I mean, I don't have that kind of time. Like I said, even if we had 3 years to do the show, I don't think I'd read all of them. But I would dip in and look at stuff. But a lot of I did, for the most part, try to stick to ones that had been published or widely circulated when this was being covered. But not all of them. I mean, I was trying to avoid. There were a couple of emails that were released in the press that were very, very personal, and I felt like those weren't. Those had nothing to do with the show I was doing. Like, I'm doing a show about how this attack impacted the industry and kind of movies that get made and the people who work in Hollywood. I don't know if putting out the kind of nastiest or like most private stuff out there, it doesn't help me tell the story, and I was uncomfortable doing so anyway. But I try to stick to emails that illustrated how the movie came together, how the studio reacted when North Korea in the summer of 2014 started taking offense to the movie, and also just about how some emails that are about how Hollywood projects come together. I mean, there was a whole back and forth about this proposed Alf movie, and I got very. I mean, that's the thing where on the surface you're like, well, that's a dumb thing to get interested in, but it's a lot of emails about an Alf movie. And if you pay attention to these emails, you can really see how a project starts out with all this excitement, and everyone's like, yes, let's do this. This is great. Here's a great script. And then you can kind of see how a certain fatigue and a real kind of questioning kind of settles in. And this was also something that was done by, Amy Pascal helped oversee this. And I think you see her thinking process. So stuff like that, it's like, it's very funny to hear grown-ups talk about Alf. That's just entertaining. But also, like, you do get a sense of like why movie A gets made and movie B doesn't get made. And I thought that stuff was kind of helpful. But I didn't always, at the same time, these emails have been online now for almost a decade. I didn't feel a super amount of guilt going through them, but you don't feel great. I mean, it's people's personal email messages, and even if they're 10 years old and about stupid stuff, you still feel a little, it's not your conversation to be a part of. So yeah, you feel a little bit like you're spying. It's not the best feeling in the world.
I did want to say, you brought up the Alf movie. I think that's a great thing that people will take away from this podcast series, is the fact that you do kind of get into the head of what it's like to run a studio like Sony, and what's the thought process like, especially for Amy, who's an incredible creator, and just hearing about the dialogue that's going on, like, why are we doing this? And I thought that was it was fascinating to get into that. So I do think like that's a great aspect of the story.
I mean, I do think Hollywood has been so good. One thing that fascinates about the story is that Hollywood's greatest product has always kind of been Hollywood. The image that we all have of like these very smart, extremely talented and glamorous, prestigious people making this product. And, the Sony hack demystifies a lot of that, because when you read it, you're like, oh, these people are very smart still. Some of them are very glamorous. But they still have days where they kind of sound like a schmo like me, where it's just sort of like, why are we doing this? Like, it's like, and I think anyone who's ever worked on any project, whether it's a journalism project or any kind of creative endeavor, has had those moments where they have these conversations where you're like, I can't believe we just spent 25 minutes discussing a serial comma, or like, I can't believe the amount of time we're spending on this one like transition sentence, and it's hilarious, and it's like, oh, these people are just as lost sometimes in their work, literally and figuratively, as I am.
Yeah.
It's like the magazine said, stars, they're just like us.
I know, exactly. Yeah.
Well, okay, but speaking of all of that, though, I do also wonder, had this not been a Hollywood story, do you think that it would have gotten the attention that it got then, and that it would have been revisited? Because, I mean, this isn't the only hack that's happened. It's got, Hollywood involved, and studios and celebrities and...
Yeah, because there've been other, sort of corporate hacks in the 2010s that were notable. And, they also involve stolen emails. But, it's like, I'm just making it up, but like, I don't think if someone were to hack, Kroger groceries database, would there be the sexiest exchanges? I apologize to anyone. I don't know why I picked a random supermarket behemoth to pick on. But the fact that these emails were written by movie stars, feature discussions about movie stars, got into things like, should Spider-Man be part of the, of the Sony picture, or should Spider-Man be part of the Marvel movie world, like stuff that people were really, really, really interested in. I think if this had been 175,000 emails from like the Pep Boys office, we'd be like, oh, all right, moving on. There's nothing. The fact that this was Hollywood did make it a perfect target. And I think and I think you also saw that with the Democratic National Committee emails that leaked. Like, if it's Hollywood or politics, that involves famous people, and when there's famous people involved in a hack or famous properties, people care. Everything else, just I don't know whether you get feel that excited about, kind of more workaday kind of corporations and industries.
Not to say though, just for clarification that the emails wouldn't have been any less salacious. I worked at, I'll just say, a very popular coffee chain when I graduated
Okay.
college. Very popular. And if the team had an email train, trust me, it would have been a hot mess.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Great reading,
Yeah, of
because
course.
these are
Yeah,
young
yeah,
people in their 20s. But yeah, I don't think anybody would have cared what we were
yeah.
up to.
Right, how do you, again, looking back and doing the research, what did you think about how journalists covered the story back then? Because there are parts of the news where you had Seth Rogen or you had Michael Linton, who was the CEO of Sony Pictures, who were really upset that the media was, going through private emails. I guess looking back, it raises sort of ethical questions like how did journalists cover that story back then? And kind of like, do you think it would be covered any differently today?
It's interesting that we're talking today because maybe a month ago, there was a hack of Disney's internal Slack channels. And so for the last 5 or 6 weeks, I've been kind of wondering, when is that stuff going to come out? I mean, there's no Gawker in 2024 to cover that. There's nowhere near as many
Right.
digital publishers as there were in 2014. And it's only today where the Wall Street Journal, I think, did a story basically kind of saying what was in it. And it was clearly very measured. They were not going after salacious stuff. It was only stuff that had to deal with like Disney park attendance and Disney, revenues. So I think the combination of the Sony hack and I think the DNC emails gave a lot of journalists, just in terms of how we cover now, gave journalists a lot of food for thought in terms of, okay, if a bad actor is leaking stuff intentionally, what do you do with that information? Do you just seize it and run it out, run all of it, which is kind of what happened with the Sony hack? Or are you aware that you're doing, someone else's bidding basically by doing that? So I think in 2024, I think there'd be some real hesitation about jumping on this material. At the same time, I think the entire Sony hack contents would have just been on Reddit the next day. I mean, it would have been there, but I think the kind of more mainstream publications would have spent a little more time vetting it, more discussions. But I think in 2014, it was so competitive, it was so new. This stuff was admittedly so juicy that most of the places covering it did it with a kind of zeal and a thoroughness that, even though I agree with Michael Linton and Seth Rogen, these are private emails, this was a story. And, I know that there's a lot of hand wringing over how to cover it among some people. I know there was no hand wringing among some other people who were covering it who were just like, I mean, some people I talked to on background who worked in the digital sphere in 2014 were like, this is a great story. We ran everything we could. Like we milked that as much as we could. But I think there was a little bit of, what are the lines here? What are we crossing? And I got the sense that when I talked to a couple of journalists who covered it, they didn't feel necessarily great about it, but they did feel this was an important story. This was a huge corporation, and these were documents that shed a lot of insight into how a major corporation is run, and some of the things that were in those emails were not good. Did not make Sony look good, and that is a story, for better or worse.
You one of the leaks that I thought that it was for me that was the most interesting was about the gender pay gap
Mm,
of, in particular, looking at American Hustle and how Amy Adams and Jennifer Lawrence were paid less than the male co-stars Bradley Cooper and Christian Bale. And I guess, it was interesting the fallout from that, having both um, Amy and Jennifer talk about, that issue afterwards. But I guess it comes to also like there were some who said, well, there was a good that came out of out of that leak. And, I know there were some people who also took issue. Again, Seth Rogen, who was like, he felt, of course, it was ridiculous to say that something good came out of, because actually you had the female head of a major studio who lost their job over that, and that being Amy
yeah.
Pascal. And he was saying, so that's kind of ridiculous to say that. But I guess, again, I don't want to make it sound that way, but was there at least did that kind of start the discussion back then about the gender pay gap from the journalistic aspect, or maybe was it still going to happen anyway, had it not been for those emails leaked?
I don't know if it's one of those things where I don't think this started that movement. I think it gave it a lot of momentum. I think, a couple of months
Mm,
after, so the Sony hack was in November 2014. A couple months later, Patricia Arquette won an Oscar for Boyhood, and her speech was about pay inequity in Hollywood. And it's this speech, if you've ever seen the GIF of Jennifer Lopez and Meryl Streep standing up and clapping at the Oscars, it was this speech. It was a very notable Oscar speech. Um, and I do think that there was a sense after the Sony hack that there, at least especially in the entertainment industry and in the media industry, is like something has to change. I think the fact that, if Jennifer Lawrence and Amy Adams, if their back end compensation for their movie is not as much as their male co-stars, like if Jennifer Lawrence can't get a good deal out of her bosses, like I think some people said, well, what am I getting out of it? Where if it goes that high, I think the idea that this was something that could and should be talked about definitely took root in the Sony hack. I think a lot of the movements that happened afterward, um, I think Me Too would have happened. I think Oscar So White would have happened. But I think the Sony hack did sort of kind of open up the conversation so those other conversations could. I think it kind of opened up the auditorium so those conversations could take place. If I can use an incredibly bulky analogy, whether it's a good thing though, I don't know. I mean, I asked everyone. I asked a lot of people who worked at Sony about that, and it's really hard to say. I mean, again, it's one of those things where these kind of things had to be brought to light, and there was some really good that came out of it. But is it worth the disrupting the lives of thousands of people who had nothing to do even with this movie in some cases? And I do think it's I don't know. I don't have like an easy answer for that, though I think about it a lot. I mean, what is the greater good of anything that happens? I will say, if something this bad does happen, I'm glad there was at least some upside to it. I mean, I'm glad there is
Hmm.
even a little bit of upside to debate from all of this, because it was a scary thing, and it upended people's careers and lives in a permanent way in some ways.
It's interesting because I actually, because of your podcast, I watched the full interview of that you featured of uh, Amy Pascal talking to Tina Brown at the women,
Oh yeah,
and they asked her about the gender pay gap, and her response like blew me away because she was just like, "Listen, we work in a business. Like,
yeah,
if I'll pay you less if you accept it." And she's like,
yeah,
if women want to get paid less, then don't accept the job. That's the only way. And I was like, ouch. That was kind of hard. I get
yeah.
what she's talking about, but it did seem a little bit, it was interesting hearing that perspective from her, even after all that happened.
That's a very raw interview, and I mean, it happened right after she
Yeah.
kind of lost her job. And I have to say, Amy Pascal, to publicly lose your job and then keep your commitment to a
Yeah.
conference that is going to be recorded and documented in public. I mean, that's pretty brave. I don't know if I would
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah.
And it's like I think that comment. I remember when I found that comment again a couple months ago, and I was kind of shocked she said that. But it's like I don't think she's lying. I think she's pointing out how a lot of people think,
She's being
in
real about
various
the
industries.
industry. She's
Yeah,
being real
yeah,
about the industry.
absolutely.
that's so interesting though, because and now all of this is making me think of like this is 2014. Okay, my sense of time is so messed up. Thank you, pandemic. But I think it was earlier this year in 2014 when we learned from the launch of the revamp of Color Purple that Taraji B. Henson had been getting
Oh,
shafted in her paychecks,
Oh, right. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, that was recent. Yeah.
which
Yeah.
also says to me like,
Last
okay,
year.
so obviously you add in the racial pay gap with the gender pay gap, but that even though the discussion is being had,
yeah,
it doesn't necessarily sound like, yeah, we can talk about it, but I'm not going to change anything.
yeah. And she's
Which
a
that
top
also feels
billed.
like business
Yeah,
to me.
It's busy.
yeah, and she's a top billed award nominated winning actor. I mean, like
Yeah.
that's the thing. It's like, and she's at a point in her career where her rep should not be having to fight for pay equity for her. And yeah, and I think that's in a way you could say, well, it's good the Sony hack happened. It raised awareness, but like, I don't think anyone I talked to said, yeah, we fixed that. We have fixed that problem in the industry. No one thinks that. I think there is more
Sexism
visibility.
fixed.
Yeah, they fixed it. But I do think there was a layer of transparency that was kind of placed on it. And I do think it like I said, opened the door for conversations about it. And, if you look at the New York Times and other publications in 2015, 2016, they have a lot of stories about pay gaps. And I don't know if that's all from the Sony hack, but it was in the culture and it was something you could point to. You could say the Sony hack kind of, and illustrated people what had been going on for a long time.
So for people who tune in, download, subscribe, stream, what have you, for this story, this podcast, what would you want to be their takeaway? Like after having listened to all of this, having like sort of, gotten in the Wayback Machine and reconsidered things from 10 years ago, if there was a takeaway, something to really like that was your North Star point, what would that be?
It's a good question. I'm trying to think of what the. I mean, I definitely would want people to sort of think about the long-term impact of something like this because I do think, it's very easy to look at Hollywood in 2024 and say, boy, the major studios don't make provocative movies anymore. They're just doing superhero stuff. And it's like, well,
Everyone is complaining about that. Every
yeah,
single person that I talked to was just like, I
yeah.
just lost interest.
Yeah, and like again, maybe the interview wasn't your thing, but this was kind of the last really super edgy, R-rated, big star, big studio movie, and look what a headache it was. I mean, it's the thing. It's like there's almost like you can almost understand in some ways why we don't get comedies like that anymore, because this kicked off an international incident. So I do think it's interesting to think about what the long-term impact of the hack was just on how what we see on screen. But I would also hope, I mean, again, I hope they would connect with the people who worked at Sony, and I would hope that they would kind of, understand what it's like to be hacked and go through this, and to realize that when these things happen, when it's happened again. It just happened recently with Disney. It's like a bunch of Disney employees, their Slack exchanges, which maybe were there inflammatory, maybe not, that not knowing what's out there, the not knowing of when it's going to come back and bite you, that was one of the things one of the Sony employees told me. It's like the atmosphere was you would walk across the lot and you would see someone, and it was someone who you just read something about, and then you'd get back to your desk and you'd wonder what happened in the 10 minutes I was just getting lunch. Like, what new thing came out? Should I be worried? And I think the kind of fear that these attacks provoke is really makes you. I mean, I don't take hacks seriously. Like, I do not want to be to this point in my life. Um, but I also hope people will use it as an excuse to kind of look back at the early 2010s, and maybe there's other events that we've all kind of forgotten, because I don't want people to forget about this. It was truly a seismic event in the industry.
Um, Thanks so much for doing this with us, Brian.
Oh,
And
sure. Thanks for
again,
having
this
me.
has been a
It's
great
great.
conversation, and I think people will go listen. And again, it really stirs up conversation and makes you want to dive back into the story a little bit and kind of get a sense of what was going on then, and also seeing how Hollywood has sort of changed, and hopefully how journalism maybe has changed too, and gotten a little bit more, questioning how we report on stories. One thing I want to definitely ask is, so how can people get your other content? Obviously, we're going to tell them how to get, if they want to listen to this, but how can they find you and find your other content you've created?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest stuff I've done the last couple of years has been these Ringer podcasts. So those are all available through the Big Picture feed. I think I have them all on my website, brianraftery.com. I wrote a book many years ago about the movies of 1999, which is still out, and I'm working on a new book now, but that won't be out for. I mean, hopefully I'll turn it on time. It'll be out in a couple of years, not a couple of decades. But I'm on Twitter, but I have become one of the people who only just goes on Twitter, lurks, says, "Here you go, I did this," and then gets off. But
That sounds
I
reasonable to me.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, I think this in the last couple podcasts I've done for the Ringer are probably the easiest things to find, and they're all on my website. And the Ringer makes stuff easy to find through Spotify and stuff.
Cool. Well, listen, Brian, before we let you go, we ask all of our guests the same question, and that is what drew you to journalism? What was it, the story arc that led you to be like, I want to do that?
It was actually a tale of resistance. Both my parents were journalists, so I grew up. My parents both worked at the Philadelphia Inquirer in various different locations and different capacities, and I grew up in there going to their newsrooms a lot. I grew up in a house where everyone read the paper. I grew up surrounded by journalists. And I took a look at all that when I was 15, 16 years old and said, I want to be a movie director. I don't want anything to do with these crazy writers who are always stressed out, are always on deadline. They work way too much. They're always reading 5 million things. And then I realized by the time I was 16 or 17, I was like, I'm not going to be a movie director. I don't have this. I don't have that talent or that patience. And so I eventually was just sort of in college. I worked for the college paper, and I was like, for better or worse, I like this, and for better or worse, I may have a little bit of a knack for it just because I spent my whole life reading newspapers and magazines over and over again. So yeah, I worked in the college paper, and then I lucked out, and my first job out of college was as an intern at Entertainment Weekly the summer of 1999, which was like maybe the greatest job at the greatest time. You could, I mean, it was the peak magazine era. It was the
Yeah,
peak
it
Entertainment
was.
Weekly era. It was, I was living in Manhattan for the first time, and it was a complete blast. I mean, I was living. It was back then. Entertainment Weekly was at 52nd and Broadway. TRL was at like 40, I don't know, 45th, 46th, I can't remember, but every day you would hear this screaming at 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon because TRL was taping live outside. Like that's what it just felt like you were in the middle of pop culture in 1999. So did
I think
that.
you were.
I
I
think
think
so.
you literally
Yeah.
were.
Yeah. Yeah. So I just had I was just, that was a fantastic job. And then I worked at other magazines and have been freelancing or full time off and on ever since. And I still love it. I still love journalists. I miss going to like a newsroom or an office where we're all just sitting around and working, but also talking and making sarcastic comments. Like that is a high I'll be chasing kind of the rest of my life. So, but yeah, and I still love the work. I still love the industry. It drives me crazy, but I still love doing it.
Same. That's all I
Yeah,
got.
Yep.
we're doomed.
Yeah.
We're all doomed to this.
Brian, I want to thank you so much for taking time to join us. This
Yeah,
has been
thank
a
you.
really great conversation. And yeah, this sounds like a really fascinating story that you dug into.
Yeah, thanks so much and enjoy. And yeah, I'm happy to talk. If you want to kick around any ideas for a future Alf movie, let me know. I've got a lot of got some concepts
I was
Brian,
a
going.
fan. I was a fan.
Oh, I was a
Brian,
fan too. Are you kidding?
this is it. This is the next project. It's all about Alf, the Alf movie.
I will say I have a wonderful team at the Ringer, and one of them is young enough to not really know much about Alf, and I had the delight of trying to explain what this show was, but also explaining what it was like in the 80s and 90s when you just had to watch whatever was on. Like it's like we just watched like shows like this ran for 5 years. Like it's like this. The amount of junk I watched on the big three growing up, it's kind of, though I do think Alf has some generally funny stuff in it. But yeah, that talk about a different media ecosystem.
Yeah.
Oh my God. All right. Well, on that note, then, again, thank you, thank you, thank you. And yeah, we really appreciate the conversation.
You
Thanks,
got
Brian.
it.
Bye. Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Jenna Flanagan and Dominic Camia. Music provided by Jay Cowett, research by Lori Ruthenberger. Reach out to us anytime at laidofandlookingpod@gmail.com. New episodes drop every Friday at noon.